And then you wonder why there were so many strange and weird decisions taken in World War II in Washington. Now the Americans now understand this. I had a hilarious conversation with the US Army last year. It was a very nice, I was at the Army conference in Washington last October, and there was a very nice display by the American Army Museum. And they had this marvelous poster of Eisenhower on one side and Patton on the other. I said, that is a really interesting combination. You have a great American war hero on one side. He thought I was talking about Eisenhower, and I was pointing to Patton on the back of this stand. And it was a life-size, an impressive life-size thing. And I said, you've got real American war hero on one side and the guy who orders assassination on the other. That is really good counterintelligence thinking. I think that's really smart. Intelligence set this up, didn't they? No, I didn't know Eisenhower was a German spy. Who will confirm this for me? I said, that colonel over there in intelligence, go and ask him. And there's a very nice general who's visiting the conference, who's down the corridor, giving a little briefing at the moment. Go and talk to him as well during the lunch hour and tell me if I'm wrong. He didn't come back.
Michael, one interesting about Eisenhower, which I've been sort of understood, was that he was pretty well gaga in his second term, wasn't he? What happened then?
It's very possible. The pressure and strain of being a German spy, it can be quite considerable. We saw this with Heath. Heath definitely went a bit gaga towards the end. You're constantly living a lie. You're in constant fear of being found out. Roy Jenkins had the same problem. Constant fear of being found out. Somebody once told me that they challenged Roy Jenkins and called him a traitor because of his views on the European Union. Perfectly sensible observation. But they didn't realise he was a German spy, and he said he thought Jenkins was about to have a heart attack. The guy was white as a sheet.
So what generation was Eisenhower American?
Eisenhower was about third generation, I think.
So he still had
he was Eisenhower. I mean, if you think about it, the name Eisenhower is not very American, is it? And it's a German name. It's the German family, but it goes back, and sometimes you find it goes back through marriage. You've got to, and sometimes the names are changed. Prescott Bush is another German spy, and Prescott Bush was, if you look at the Bush family, you've got Prescott Bush as a German spy, and he was third or fourth generation. The Bush family, spelled B-U-S-C-H originally, go to the United States in the 1850s, and you have Prescott Bush as a senator working for the Germans right through World War II. Very, very interesting. Of course, Bush Senior, his son, doesn't like me very much, partly because I know that his old man was a German spy. Coming back to Korea, how do we link it?
Can I just ask, going back to Eisenhower for a moment, what was the Swedish connection with Eisenhower?
The
Swedish connection.
Oh, there is a Swedish. I have to look up the files about it.
Sort of half Swedish or something, wasn't he?
No, yeah.
There was a marriage.
Yeah, there's
some Swedish blood somewhere.
Yeah, there's some Swedish blood.
Yeah.
Explains why I like Swedes.
Significant.
Yes, exactly. He probably liked saunas as well. Sweden, you've got to be very careful of Sweden. I mean, I love Sweden, been there and addressed meetings in the Parliament building in Stockholm and so on. Very fond of Sweden. Lovely aviation museum for the pilots here. Wonderful aviation museum down in Sweden at Vasterland, I think.
So,
Yeah, wonderful aviation museum and the Swedish aviation museum. Very, very good. All the old Saab bits of kit that nobody else ever bought. Love the Swedes, but your Swede can be a bit pro-German. I mean, your Swede is basically, your basic Swede comes in two types: your nice Swede and your pro-German Swede. And if we have a war with Germany, you will tend to find your Swede is doing ball bearings and iron ore.
They provided the German with ball bearings when we bombed Schweinfurt.
Exactly, yes. Schweinfurt, another interesting operation where the American Air Force was set up. General Marshall. The Schweinfurt operation, typical classic German intelligence operation. The Jerry's very nervous of the B-17. They tried to stop the B-17 being ordered. They messed around with the B-17 specifications. When the Army finally got the B-17 specs right, and the B-17 was suddenly a worthwhile aeroplane, unlike the B-17C, which was basically non-operational. When the Americans were finally allowed to get the B-17 right, and Boeing was allowed to deliver to the Army Air Corps the plane that Boeing wanted to deliver, which the Army Air Corps wanted, as opposed to the rubbish that Washington was foisting on the Army Air Corps, which they knew wouldn't be any use in combat. When the Americans finally sorted out the B-17, we had the B-17E, and then the B-17F, and the Jerrys were very, very nervous of the E and the F, because they knew that they had excellent altitude performance, wonderful turbo supercharging arrangements, really, really good turbocharging, excellent altitude performance, and the Jerrys were very nervous of the B-17. So they came up with a cunning plan. They knew that the Army Air Force wanted to escort the bombers. It's often said that the Americans relied on their box formations and the mass ranks of 50 calibers. Remember the old story about the Flying Fortress and all the 50 cals, and that was going to be their defensive. That was all nonsense. The American Air Corps, Hap Arnold, and he was a friend of a friend. No people who knew Hap Arnold. Jimmy Doolittle, Ira Eaker. These guys were smart. I mean, they were good. They knew what they were doing. And the Americans always understood that daylight bombing, the defensive firepower of the B-17s was never going to be enough, and they always needed fighters. That was always the plan. The Americans were looking for long-range fighters right from the Lockheed P-38. That was being spec'd in 1938. And that was worked on by friends of mine, Lockheed Skunk Works. That's the origin of the Skunk Works. The Lockheed P-38 was designed by the guy who did the U-2. Wonderful, wonderful man called Kelly Johnson. Super aeroplane. That didn't just come along in 42. The Americans were working on that from the mid-30s. Now, the Americans understood the need for escorts. The Germans, the Luftwaffe, understood that the escorting American fighters would be too good for them, so they came up with a plan to drag the American Air Force into an ambush beyond the range of its fighters. They knew all about the P-51. They knew once the P-51 was in service, they tried to stop the P-51. Once they'd failed to stop the P-51 in Washington, they knew they were in deep trouble in 44. They knew they had a window of opportunity for about 3 to 6 months, during which they would have P-38s, P-47s only, limited range, and the plan, the Schweinfurt plan, was to drag the Americans out beyond the range of their fighters so they could shoot the B-17s down in large numbers, and their hope was to destroy the 8th Army Air Force in one fell swoop. In order to get the Air Force to go beyond the range of its fighters, they had to come up with a tempting target. So that whole nonsense about Schweinfurt is critical to the German war effort, it wasn't. They were getting the ball bearings of Sweden anyway. They had already distributed their ball bearing just in case the Americans hit the factory. No offence intended to the Army Air Force, but just in case they actually got through and bombed the factory. The Germans had already moved away their ball bearing production. A lot of the intelligence reports were being fed were out of date anyway. General Marshall then pushes Schweinfurt in Washington. The Army Air Force are told, you've got to go outside your fighter range. So they do, and they get absolutely hammered, but thanks to great courage and really, really good flying and really, really brave performances from the 8th Army Air Force, they didn't lose the entire force, which is what the Luftwaffe had wanted. So the operation blew up a little bit in the Jerry's faces, but that was the whole idea of Schweinfurt. Tempt the Americans into going beyond fighter range, ambush them, classic ambush strategy, but in order to get an armed force to go out into a dangerous country beyond its force protection, you've got to give them a tempting target. And again, we see the German willingness to sacrifice their own people. No German intelligence chief is ever going to be reluctant to sacrifice a German city if they can achieve. Your Jerry will always write off 100,000 Jerrys in order to achieve his objects. Coming back to Korea, yes, Korea. Intelligence understood, both British and American intelligence understood that we had German pilots in Korea, and the calls we were monitoring were partly set up. What we had was Sea Furies, wonderful old aeroplane, Taurus engine, super secure. Sea Furies going in at low level in order to get them bounced by the MiGs, and then the Americans were in on this, and the Sabres were flying top cover in order to fly down on the MiGs. And both the Americans and us were monitoring the communications. The communications you were monitoring, Yaktung Sabres, have also been monitored by the Americans. And I've spoken to American naval intelligence officers who were around in Korea, who were on the other side of that operation. And yeah, absolutely. The Sabres were, the MiG-15s were bounced, and then we had over the radio, Achtung Sabres, which generally your Russian pilot would not say. So that gave the game away. The Americans have known for years that the pilots in North Korea flying MiGs were mostly Jerrys. And the same happened in Vietnam. Now, the Americans didn't initially believe this. I had a look at Adolf Gallen's resume, and I noticed an interesting gap during the Vietnam War. And I wonder what the blight he was up to during Vietnam. I knew he was doing MiG-15s in Korea. I wonder if he was doing MiG-21s in Hanoi. And I was put onto that by a wonderful guy, an old colonel who'd flown B-52s over Hanoi. I said, Michael, we were chatting away about